Have you ever stopped to think about how a single speech, literally one speech delivered over 2 centuries ago, could still be dictating the map of global power today? It's kind of wild. Think about this for a second. How does a policy written way back in 1823 by a young, militarily weak, and fiercely isolated nation somehow still provide the ultimate justification for modern global interventions? It's a massive paradox, right? But answering that question actually unlocks a whole lot of the mysteries behind modern geopolitics.
So, welcome to this explainer on the evolution of the Monroe Doctrine. The core theme we're going to be exploring today is that this doctrine, well, it isn't just dusty history. It's definitely not some static, unchangeable law written in stone. Instead, it's more like a living, mutating geopolitical tool, one that's been constantly reshaped by almost every single generation of American leadership to fit their specific needs.
Okay, let's dive into this. Here's our chronological roadmap for the explainer. We're going to start with the birth of the doctrine, trace its major shift from defense to intervention, analyze the Cold War era, examine its 21st century revival, and then finally unpack its complicated legacy. Let's just jump right in at the beginning with Section 1, the birth of the doctrine.
To really get a grasp on this, we have to set the scene. The year is 1823. The Napoleonic Wars have just recently ended over in Europe, and across the Americas, nearly all the Spanish colonies were in the process of achieving, or at least fighting for, their independence. Now, the United States was watching this pretty nervously. They feared that victorious European powers might try to swoop in, revive monarchical governments, and basically recolonize these newly independent nations in the Western Hemisphere. And it was exactly that fear that birthed the Monroe Doctrine. At its core, it was a U.S. foreign policy opposing European colonialism. It essentially held that any foreign intervention in the political affairs of the Americas would be seen as a direct, hostile act against the United States itself. Crafted primarily by Secretary of State John Quincy Adams and delivered by President James Monroe, its original intent was strictly defensive. The whole goal was simply to keep the Old World and the New World in completely separate, distinct spheres.
President Monroe laid it out incredibly clearly in his 1823 address, stating, "The American continents are henceforth not to be considered as subjects for future colonization by any European powers." But guys, here is the grand irony of that incredibly bold claim. At the time, the U.S. basically had zero credible navy to actually enforce this. I mean, it was a massive bluff. In reality, they relied tactically on the British Royal Navy to enforce it. Britain, you see, wanted to keep European rivals out of Latin America, so British merchants could enjoy free trade with all these new nations. So for decades, it was actually British ships, not American ones, that were making Monroe's bold words a reality.
Moving right along, that brings us to Section 2, from defense to intervention.
As we roll into the late 19th and early 20th centuries, we see the doctrine's major plot twist. The United States was rapidly industrializing, its navy was finally growing, and its ambitions were seriously expanding, transforming it into a formidable world power. In 1865, the U.S. confidently amassed troops at the border to essentially force France's puppet monarch out of Mexico. Then, jump to 1895, during a border dispute between Venezuela and Britain, Secretary of State Richard Olney made an absolutely staggering claim. He basically declared that the United States was practically sovereign on this continent. Just let that sink in. 3 years later, the Spanish-American War in 1898 really cemented this shift, leaving the U.S. with literal protectorates like Cuba and Puerto Rico.
Now, what's really interesting about this is the stark contrast in intents. In 1823, the original intent was a shield, right? European powers must stay out. But fast forward to 1904, and President Theodore Roosevelt completely flips the doctrine from a shield into a weapon, with his Roosevelt Corollary. He boldly declared that if Latin American nations failed to pay their debts or maintain order, well, the U.S. had the right to preemptively intervene just to keep Europe from doing it.
This was the dawn of Roosevelt's famous big stick ideology. This new rationale justified sweeping U.S. interventions in places like Cuba, Panama, Honduras, Nicaragua, Haiti, and the Dominican Republic. The U.S. had effectively appointed itself as the hemispheric policeman. They'd send in the Marines, seize customs houses, and secure economic benefits by force. And as you might expect, while this was fantastic for American banks and corporations, it sparked massive outrage and really deep-seated resentment across Latin America. And that sets the perfect stage for Section 3, the Cold War era. Following the end of World War II, the geopolitical landscape totally fractured into this tense bipolar struggle between the United States and the Soviet Union. And guess what? The Monroe Doctrine mutated once again. This time, it was repurposed as an anti-communist shield.
The United States felt this incredibly pressing need to protect the Western Hemisphere, not from traditional colonial armadas this time, but from Soviet ideological and political subversion. Under this new rationale, the U.S. began funneling heavy intelligence and military aid to Latin American governments. And actually, sometimes these were highly authoritarian governments, just as long as they claimed they were being threatened by communism. This rationale led directly to some of the most highly charged interventions in modern history. In 1954, the CIA helped overthrow the Guatemalan government. In 1962, the entire world held its breath during the Cuban Missile Crisis, where President John F. Kennedy actually explicitly cited the Monroe Doctrine to justify blockading Soviet missiles in Cuba. And then in the 1980s, during the Iran-Contra affair in Nicaragua, CIA Director Robert Gates vigorously defended covert operations by arguing that stopping the intervention would mean totally abandoning the Monroe Doctrine. By this point, that 1823 policy had literally become the ultimate Cold War blank check.
Let's move into our fourth section, the 21st Century Revival.
Now, if you thought the doctrine just quietly faded away with the fall of the Soviet Union, think again. What is so fascinating about the modern era is how radically recent administrations have ping-ponged on the doctrine's legitimacy. Back in 2013, the Obama administration tried to officially close the book on it. Secretary of State John Kerry famously stood before the Organization of American States and declared, point blank, "The era of the Monroe Doctrine is over." The administration's whole goal there was to replace the historical pattern of unilateral U.S. intervention with a new era, one of mutual partnership and equality among all American states.
But, as we know, this shift did not last long at all, resulting in some severe geopolitical whiplash. The Kerry Doctrine, which emphasized multilateralism and equal partnership, was quickly replaced by a highly explicit revival of the policy under the Trump administration, what's often referred to as the Trump corollary. This approach brought back a strong America First perspective. It openly treated the world as being divided into distinct spheres of influence among great powers like the U.S., Russia, and China, with a very clear goal to restore absolute American preeminence right in its own hemisphere.
The implementation of this revived doctrine was viewed by critics as incredibly swift and aggressive. The 2025 National Security Strategy officially called to reassert and enforce the Monroe Doctrine. This led to massive naval deployments down in the Caribbean, which a lot of foreign policy experts widely likened to old-fashioned gunboat diplomacy. And of course, this all culminated in the dramatic 2026 raid and capture of Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro. President Trump himself even stylized this aggressive application as the Monroe Doctrine.
Following that event in 2026, Donald Trump summarized this modern viewpoint stating, "American dominance in the Western Hemisphere will never be questioned again." It's a quote that really clearly signals a return to treating the Western Hemisphere strictly as a U.S. sphere of influence. It echoes those aggressive assertions we saw back in the late 19th century, but obviously this time backed with 21st century military capability.
Which brings us right to our final section, a complicated legacy.
Let's just zoom out for a second here. How do we even begin to evaluate the impact of this 200-year-old policy? Like, how do historians and international law experts view a doctrine that's been used to justify both the protection of young republics and the overthrow of sovereign governments? Well, historian William Appleman Williams actually coined a brilliant term for it: imperial anti-colonialism. He argues that the U.S. effectively utilized the rhetoric of being anti-colonial, telling Europe to stay out to protect freedom, while simultaneously establishing its very own regional hegemony. The fundamental flaw here, as critics argue, is that while the Monroe Doctrine placed strict limitations on what Europe could do in the Americas, it never placed a single limitation on what the United States itself could do.
So the crucial point is captured incredibly powerfully by the linguist and political critic Noam Chomsky. He states that, in practice, the doctrine is a declaration of hegemony and a right of unilateral intervention over the Americas. For a lot of critics across the globe, and especially within Latin America, the doctrine really isn't remembered as some sort of protective shield. Instead, it's viewed as a paternalistic justification for American imperialism.
And that leaves us with a final, really provocative question to think about. In a modern multipolar world, a world where economic and political power is distributed across so many global players, can any one nation truly still claim an entire hemisphere as its exclusive sphere of influence? I mean, the Monroe Doctrine started out as a desperate bluff by a young nation. It transformed into an iron-fisted rule of hemispheric dominance, and today it remains one of the most hotly debated foreign policies in existence. So what do you think its next evolution is going to be? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. I really hope it gave you a whole new perspective on the history that's happening right in front of us.